It was an anxious young man who hurried to the Padres that evening along familiar paths, carrying a burlap bag full of leftovers, an old empty pistol, and a head full of choices. The faces and animals at the public tent, the shores, hills, and trees, all pulled at him with promises of safety and security. The woods are lovely, dark, and deep. Valentine went into the backyard, checked on the animals, and began to chop wood. Turning cordwood into kindling always cleared his mind, even if it left his body wet and rubbery. He had been doing this chore for the Padre and for a number of the neighbors in trade for sugar or flour since his arrival 5 years ago. The solid feel of the axe in his hands, the thwack as the blade sank into the dried wood, absorbed the things that bubbled up from the dark corners of his mind. He stacked the splintered results of his labor and went inside the house. Valentine found the three men sprawled in the smoke-filled library around an empty bottle and a mostly empty jug. A small bag of letters, including a couple from a young lady named Gaffley, sat on the Padres' nicked-up table, and a much larger bundle of letters lay tucked in one of the men's satchels, ready for the long return trip south. The one called Finner paged rapidly through a battered volume titled Classic Nudes Through the Photographer's Lens.
Ah, David. You missed some boring catching up, and some even more boring drinking.
He didn't bother rising from his barely upholstered chair.
Did you win the race?
Sort of. Doesn't matter.
He told the story, ending with his being disqualified.
Sheesh. I'm with you, Jess.
I'd like to hear how you knew my father, Mr. Samuels.
Samuels looked at the Padre.
It's always Paul when I'm off my feet, son. When I was a kid, about your age, give or take, your dad and I used to come up together from down south, just like me and Jess do now. We like to keep in touch with the folks up here in this old fraud. Well-lubricated philosophy sessions, you might say.
Valentine began distributing the bounty from the public tent. The men dug in with the enthusiasm of days spent on the road, eating only what the wilderness provided.
You fight them, right? The Curians, the Reapers, the things they make? And the patrols, right?
Patrols are what we call the Quislings up here nowadays.
Well, not all at once, son. In fact, we spend more time running scared from them than we do standing and fighting. We can hit them here and there where we don't stand too much of a chance of getting hit back. When we're not doing that, we're trying to keep from starving. Ever drunk water out of a hoof print to wash down a couple handfuls of ground-up ants? Slept outside in the rain without even a tent? Worn the same shirt for a month straight? Really stinks, son. And I don't just mean the shirt.
Valentine stood as tall as he could, trying to add a couple of inches to his 6'1".
I'd like to join up, sir.
I knew you could talk him into it.
A week later, Father Max saw the party off on a warm, sun-dappled morning. He gave David an old, musty-smelling hammock. It had uses other than rest. The Padre showed him how to roll his spare clothing up in it, then tie it across his back. By the time that was finished, other recruits who had collected over the past days began to shoulder their own burdens. Most carried backpacks bulging with preserved food. Valentine found that there were mouthfuls of words to be said and no time or privacy to say them.
God be with you, David.
The graying old man's eyes were wet with tears.
All right. Don't worry about me. Jacob Christensen said he'd help out around here. He wants to teach the younger kids, too, so you don't have to...
The Padre held out his gnarled hand for a handshake.
Yes, David, I'll be fine. Soon you'll have more important things to worry about than getting the cow milked and the chickens fed. But the day I quit teaching the kids their ABCs is the day I'll be resting in the ground.
Samuels and Finner also shook hands with the Padre. How the men looked so alert was beyond Valentine. They seemed to be up every night drinking and talking, then visiting the trading wagons and surrounding homes in the day. David guided them, leading them on backwoods paths to the households that matched the names on the mail. One visit stood out. when Samuels had called on an old woman to deliver a few personal effects from her dead son, who had been a friend of Samuel's. That night, there had been more drinking and less laughter in the library. Valentine began to learn on the first day of the journey south. He learned just how sore his legs could get. Though he had walked all day many times in his life, he had never done so with better than 40 pounds of food, water, and possessions on his back, at a pace set by a demanding sergeant. Other volunteers joined the group as they walked. One whom he knew, Gabriella Cho, had gone to the Padres school for a number of years. Her rich black hair had fascinated Valentine as he struggled through the awkward rites of puberty. Necessities at home kept her out of school past the age of 15. She had blossomed into a woman since Valentine had last seen her 2 years ago.
Gabby! So you're coming too?
He was relieved to be finally taller than the doe-eyed young woman. She looked at him once, twice.
Davy? Yeah, I'm taking the big trip.
We missed you. Father Max had to start asking the rest of us the tough questions. It wasn't the same since you left.
No, nothing's been the same since then.
When she replied to further questions with one-word answers and downcast eyes, Valentine ended the conversation. They spent the first evening at an overgrown crossroads more than a dozen miles south of the Padres. They made camp and spent the next day talking, waiting, and nursing sore muscles. Another soldier showed up, escorting 4 more recruits. 2 of the men were twin brothers, 6-foot 6-inch blonde giants. Valentine was surprised to learn their names were Kyle and Pete, rather than Thor and Odin. They repeated the process as they hiked south and west in easy stages. Easy, that was, in the estimation of the men who bore the title Wolves. To Valentine, each day proved more exhausting than the last. By the time they reached the outskirts of Minneapolis, the group had swelled to 30 soldiers and over 100 young men and women. Lieutenant Skellen met them at a boat they used to cross the Mississippi. The lieutenant wore an eye patch so wide it could just as well have been labeled an eye scarf, which mostly covered a crescent-shaped scar on the left side of his face. He had dozens more recruits with him. Like the sergeants, they were in their teens, or barely out of them, wide-eyed and homesick among new landscapes and unfamiliar faces. The travelers made a wide loop west around the Twin Cities into empty lands teeming with prairie plants. One day, they skirted 100-head herd of mountains of hair and hide, and the wolves informed Valentine he was looking at his first buffalo.
Ain't no weather can kill those big shaggies.
Fenner nodded knowingly at his charges from the boundary waters.
The cows and wild horses gotta find low wooded spots when the snow's blowing out here, but them buffalo just form a big circle and wait it out.
Valentine picked up much more on that journey south. He learned that he could make a compass by stropping an old double-edged razor blade against the back of his hand. Charged with static electricity, he suspended it from a string in a preserve jar to shield it from the wind. The little piece of metal found north after wavering indecisively like a bird dog sniffing the breeze. The recruits learned how and where to build a fire, using reflectors made of piled logs to hide the flame and direct the heat back toward the camper. He was taught about trench fires in high wind, and to always roast game skewered on a spit beside a fire, not over it, with a pan underneath to catch every drop of the valuable fat. They learned how to make flour, not only from wheat, but also with the flour heads at the end of cattails, and even with bark. Valentine pounded masses of bark in a pan of water, removed the fibers, and allowed it to settle, then poured off the water and toasted the pulpy starch on a stick. Even with salt, it did not taste like much, but he found himself able to eat just about anything as the long weeks of walking wore on. Even more incredibly, he gained weight, though he was hungry from dawn to dusk. When their packs emptied, they didn't always have to live off the land. They stopped at isolated farmhouses and tiny hidden enclaves where the residents fed them, passing out bags of beans and corn flour to the 100-odd campers resting in their fields. Valentine practiced with his pistol. The wolves passed a hat around and collected 24 bullets from the men with handguns that used the same ammunition as his. Some of the wolves carried up to 3 sidearms in order to have a better chance at using bullets acquired from scavenging the deceased after a fight. Valentine plinked away at old paint cans and weathered paint-stripped road signs. It was during one of these marksmanship sessions in an old barn near camp that Valentine made an effort to talk to Sergeant Samuels. He had just knocked down a row of 3 aluminum cans, their colored labels illegible with the passage of years, and he was feeling pretty full of himself.
You should try it with your left hand.
That cleaned the self-satisfied smile from Valentine's face in a hurry.
Why, Sergeant?
What if your right arm's busted, kid? What if someone just blew your hand off? I know most instructors say it's a waste of time. Me, I think it's good to use your offhand. Makes your brain and body work different than it's used to.
Valentine set one of the cans back up, the sharp cordite smell tickling his nostrils. Feeling awkward, he raised the gun to eye level, feet shoulder-width apart. He sent the can flying with the second shot.
May I?
Valentine passed him the gun. The sergeant examined it professionally.
This was your dad's?
No, Sergeant. I suppose he's a neighbor. He gave it to me.
Gun like this? It's in great shape. He must have thought a lot of you.
He handed the gun back to Valentine.
More like he thought a lot of my parents.
He paused for a moment, not sure how to phrase the question.
You seem to think a lot of my father, too. I never knew about his life before he met my mother. He just said he traveled.
Samuels glanced out the missing barn doors. The campsite was nearly empty. A heavy patrol was out under the lieutenant, and most of the recruits were taking advantage of the afternoon off to wash clothes and bathe in the nearby river.
Yeah, David, I knew him. Not from way back, from before the skies filled with ash, that is. We met in Michigan, soon after all this shit started. I was younger than you then, maybe 15. Your dad and I were in this outfit. We called ourselves the Band. Fighting sometimes, hiding mostly. Cops, army guys, we had some Coast Guard sailors from Lake Michigan even. The uniform was a hat with a piece of camouflage material sewn on it somewhere. God, what a hungry, sorry-looking bunch we were. Even when we were blasting away at the grogs, we couldn't really believe it. It was like something out of a sci-fi movie. No one knew shit about what was going on. I used to cry every damn night, it seemed to me. My parents were in Detroit when the nuke went off, you see. I learned one thing. Tears make you feel better, but they don't change anything. You'll still be hungry when they dry up, still be lonely.
The 2 men, one mature and weathered, the other a few years past puberty, wandered out of the barn and watched the sun descend into the western haze. Samuels nodded to a couple of the wolves carrying out camp duties. Then he sat down on the corpse of an old green tractor. The space where the engine once sat gaped, an open wound with wires dangling.
So you were both wolves then?
Valentine omitted the "sir," since they were both sitting.
No, that came later. God, we didn't know what to think.